In 1971, a group of students volunteered for a psychology experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment. They were healthy, educated, ordinary. They were randomly assigned roles. Some became prisoners, others became guards. Within days, the ones playing the role of guards exercised authority with increasing severity, not because they were cruel, not because they were ideologically driven, but because the role itself authorized their actions.
At this point, one of the fascinating things that emerged was the new relationship between prisoners and guards. The guards now fell into their job. Some of them liked it, some of them disliked it, but it was a job that they did. They gave commands, and now what happened is the prisoners followed them automatically without questioning in a servile way. The guards then began to escalate their use of power to do things which were really degrading and humiliating. When the prisoners did it without complaining, just did it because this is what they had to do.
No hatred had to be invented, no doctrine had to be imposed. The experiment was shut down early because participants were experiencing severe psychological distress and escalating abusive behavior.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a role, a job, saying your job is to keep these people in line, then you're not certainly not the same person that you're in street clothes and in a different role. You really become that person once you put on that khaki earphone, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part.
What the experiment revealed was not an anomaly, but a mechanism long embedded into social and political structures. Long before it was observed in a laboratory, that same mechanism had already been put into practice, not as an experiment, but as a political order. In the 19th century, it took the form of a nation. For a nation that proclaims that all men are created equal, early 19th century United States faced a bitter paradox: what to do with all the black people freed from slavery. In 1816, a coalition of white politicians, clergy, and slaveholders formed the American Colonization Society, or ACS, to solve what they saw as the problem of a growing free black population. Their solution was to transport freed African Americans across the ocean to Africa, creating a new colony where black people could supposedly thrive separately. Because, according to them, white and black people could never coexist, and thus began a journey draped in high ideals and dark irony, a plan to export liberty itself, even if it meant imposing on someone else's land. The choice of Liberia on Africa's west coast was no accident, yet it wasn't entirely by grand design either. The British had already established a colony in Sierra Leone in the 1790s, which was also a colony for freed slaves, and the ACS seemed to follow that example by seeking a neighboring spot for America's free slaves. An early ACS funded voyage in 1818 explored Sherbro Island as a potential site, but the swampy land and deadly disease wiped out many settlers. Learning from this failure, the Society's agents roamed the Pepper Coast for a better location, a location we know today as Liberia. In 1821, with the help of a U.S. naval officer, they identified Cape Mesurado, a region formerly used for trade, including, of course, the slave trade. When diplomacy failed, Lieutenant and former U.S. Senator Robert Stockton, whose greatest hits also include the capture of California during the Mexican American War, resorted to brute coercion, reportedly holding one local leader at gunpoint until he agreed to cede a strip of land. For a few $100s worth of goods, the ACS acquired a new colony carved out under threat. They didn't choose the best land, they chose the land they could take. The settlers, formerly enslaved, arrived to find themselves confined to a narrow coastal strip already inhabited by local populations. They proceeded to name their settlement Christopolis and set about fortifying it almost immediately. Conflict followed quickly. In 1822, indigenous fighters launched an attack to drive the settlers out. The settlers, armed and desperate, managed to hold them off. This skirmish became legend among the colonists, epitomized by the possibly apocryphal tale of a settler woman, Matilda Newport, who lit a cannon with her pipe to save the day. The newcomers responded by fortifying their enclave with walls and trenches. Violence did not interrupt Liberia's founding, it inaugurated it. The American Colonization Society was not ideologically unified. Some members were genuine abolitionists who believed a black republic in Africa could offer freedom denied in the United States. Others were enslavers and white supremacists who viewed free black Americans as a destabilizing threat. And others were pragmatic politicians who saw colonization as a way to reduce racial tension at home while extending American influence abroad. Even some black leaders supported the project, seeing Africa as an opportunity beyond American racism. In theory, it was presented as a win win arrangement. In practice, the whole idea rested on a shared assumption that was rarely questioned that black and white people could never live as equals in the United States. That assumption, more than any single motive, held the project together. In 1824, a mere 2 years after surviving the first attacks, the settlers formally named their territory Liberia, Latin for freedom. It was General Robert Goodloe Harper, a Maryland politician and slave owner, who proposed this hopeful name. They named their new capital Monrovia, honoring the slave owner and former U.S. President James Monroe, an avid ACS supporter who had secured federal funds for the project. The very nomenclature of Liberia dripped with idealism and homage to the American Republic. After all, these black settlers saw themselves as pioneers of freedom, carving out the world's second black republic after Haiti. In 1847, they declared Liberia an independent nation, issuing a Declaration of Independence modeled on the one written by the former oppressors. Their flag bore a lone star and stripes, echoing the U.S. flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of Liberia and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
America, join me. I pledge allegiance.
And their constitution and government institutions mirrored American models. Everything about Liberia's founding seemed to shout,
America.
from the settlers' perspective, they were more than immigrants. They were missionaries of a sort, agents of uplift carrying the light of America's values to Africa. Many were devout Christians, fluent in English, dressed in Western attire, and versed in the Republican ideals of their birthland. They spoke of bringing civilization and biblical faith to their ancestral continent. One colonization society publication of the time described their mission in grandiose and condescending terms to transform Africa's profound ignorance and barbarism into knowledge and Christianity. In these settlers' minds, they weren't oppressors. They were torchbearers of freedom and morality, chosen to build a nation that could even redeem the African continent. This mindset gave them a sense of moral superiority over both the slaveholders they escaped from and the indigenous Africans they encountered. After all, as Liberia's later motto proudly proclaimed, the love of liberty brought us here. Yet here lies the darkest irony. Believing themselves liberators, the settlers quickly assumed the role of a ruling class. They were only a tiny group on a foreign shore, a few hundred at most. Yet they claimed dominion over territories inhabited by tens of thousands of indigenous people. The very confidence that sustained them through hardship also bred a profound blindness to others' rights. They saw the local tribes as uncultivated and inferior. This attitude hardened over time into a stark social division. Americo-Liberians, as they came to call themselves, versus the indigenous Africans. Though they shared African ancestry and skin color, the settlers considered themselves heirs of Western civilization, bringing light to their heathen brethren. They built American style houses along the coast, established churches and schools, and largely kept to themselves, preserving the culture they brought from the United States rather than assimilating into local cultures. In their eyes, they were fulfilling a grand destiny, a unique experiment of black self rule that paradoxically mimicked the very nation that had enslaved them. On the other hand of this encounter were the many ethnic groups already living on the land. For these indigenous communities, the arrival of shiploads of black foreigners from across the sea was bewildering and increasingly threatening. The newcomers claimed ownership of coastal enclaves and soon started extending their reach. Backed by the ACS and occasionally the US Navy, the settlers simply took land from others.
These bloody immigrants, they come over here, they're up to no good, right? I hate these bloody immigrants, they need to go back to where they came from. But why do you hate them so much? I'll tell you why I hate them. I'll tell you why, right? Because they're not even trying to be British. That's why. They don't even try to be British, right? They come here, they bring their own bloody culture, right? They bring their own food, speak their own bloody languages, try to take over the whole bloody place. Well, that sounds British to me. I mean...
Over time, Liberia's territory grew, and with it grew the determination of the Americo-Liberian elite to entrench their power over the region. They established a government and militia dominated by settlers, excluding the vast native majority from real authority. By the time Liberia declared independence from the ACS in 1847, the pattern was set. Power resided with the Americo-Liberians, while the original inhabitants were largely kept on the margins of their own land. The inequality was not just political, but economic and social. The colonists exploited indigenous people as a source of cheap labor on farms and infrastructure, much as European colonizers did elsewhere. They introduced a system of forced labor and household servitude for local peoples, eerily echoing the oppression the settlers' ancestors had endured. Only now they were in charge. An uneasy caste system was formed, with Americo-Liberians at the top enjoying privileges and education, and indigenous communities at the bottom, labeled as natives to be civilized or used, rather than equal citizens. This segregationist society was propped up by laws and customs that kept political power and voting rights in settlers' hands well into the 20th century. Resentment naturally grew among the indigenous Liberians. There were rebellions and resistance, from small acts of defiance to organized uprisings. But the Americo-Liberian governments put them down brutally, often with the same sense of righteousness that slave owners once used against them to justify harsh discipline. Liberia's early history exposes a structural continuity in the exercise of power. Emancipation does not dismantle domination. It often reallocates it. When authority shifts, the mechanisms through which it operates, hierarchy, exclusion, coercion, tend to remain intact, merely administrated by new actors.
Django, this is another cheeky black bugger like yourself, Stephen. Stephen, this here's Django. You two ought to hate each other.
This pattern appears even in extreme historical contexts. In Nazi concentration camps, for example, certain Jewish prisoners were forced into intermediary roles and granted limited privileges. Under these conditions, some enforced discipline with a severity that far exceeded that of the SS guards themselves, driven by fear and the precarious need to preserve those privileges. Power in such systems survives not by benevolence, but by inducing the oppressed to police one another. It does not disappear when it changes hands. It endures by reorganizing itself and compelling participation in its own reproduction.
Calm down, little brother. Time heals all wounds. No matter how much one is weeping, the moon always follows the sun.
These tense dynamics did not go unnoticed. A few voices, both in Liberia and abroad, questioned whether this was the freedom that had been promised. Some missionaries and travelers in the 19th century observed with unease that Liberia resembled a mini America, complete with its own embattled underclass and everything. The settlers developed a culture based around American notions of superiority and racial supremacy in their dealings with native people, a pointed reminder that racism and colonial hierarchy are not bound strictly to skin color. They are patterns of power that can be adopted by anyone who finds himself at the top. This dark irony would haunt Liberia's history, sowing seeds of discord between the descendants of the settlers and the many ethnic groups across the country, eventually contributing to explosive conflicts and civil wars in the late 20th century.
That until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race, this a war.
Amid all these contradictions, the name Liberia stood as a proud ideal and a cruel paradox. The very act of naming their land Liberia was a declaration that they too were agents of liberty. But liberty for whom? The indigenous peoples were never consulted in the grand freedom narrative. They were just expected to eventually submit. Liberia was never simply a failed utopia or a moral contradiction written into history. It was something far more unsettling, a demonstration that power does not dissolve when its victims inherit it. It reorganizes, it hardens, and learns new justifications. The Americo-Liberians did not rule because they believed themselves superior. They believed themselves superior because they ruled. Western civilization, Christianity, education, and destiny became the language through which domination explained itself. Racism did not create the hierarchy. It emerged as its justification, consolidating and normalizing an order that had already been imposed. What this story reveals with unsettling clarity is this: power consolidates itself through roles that make domination appear necessary. What endures is the structure, the division between those who govern and those who are governed, those who define the law and those who live beneath it. Liberia was named after freedom, but freedom was never granted. It was claimed by a ruling minority, guarded, institutionalized, and once secured in this form, it behaved like power always does, insulating itself, reproducing itself, and justifying its own permanence. Power does not endure through belief. It endures through roles that make belief appear necessary. Once those roles are accepted, domination no longer announces itself as force. It presents itself as order.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, even not as dismayed, to find out that I could really be that I could act in a manner so absolutely unaccustomed to anything I would even really dream of doing. And and while I was doing it. I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only afterwards when I began to reflect on what I had done that this behavior began to dawn on me, and I realized that this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.